Aloha, scooterheads, and welcome to another episode of the Electric Scooter Podcast. Welcome, no matter what pronoun you use. I just have my own pronoun. It's Dagwood. My theory is this whole pronoun thing is just a ruse for millennials to confuse boomers, but whatever. Just call me Dagwood. I like to think that at the Electric Scooter Podcast, intellectual stimulation leads to instant gratification. And I got to warn you about this episode. It's a bit of a bummer. We're going to go into a couple news items, and I'm going to continue to say that electric scooters, e-bikes, electric cars, as I've been saying since the very early episodes, they're not 100% environmentally friendly. I've said that all along. Especially these rental scooter companies where scooters do not last their intended lifespan because they're not gently cared for. They're ridden by random strangers. You're not going to get the lifespan out of an electric scooter in a rental fleet that you would one that you privately own and care for and maintain. That's just the way it is. They get thrown into lakes, rivers, off of bridges. That kind of thing's not going to happen with a private scooter. Also, they go around in the morning and they collect them all in a big truck that's belching smoke and noxious fumes into the air. I don't know how many times a day they do it. I'm sure they do it at least once a day, maybe twice, once in the morning and once in the evening. They got to round them up, charge them, check them out. Also, the batteries have to be dug out of the earth. Forget about all the contaminants and everything that brings. How about these big, giant construction yellow gear trucks that are digging into the earth? They're not electric. Scooters, e-bikes, electric cars, they are not impact-free on our environment. And today, you're going to hear from somebody who's gone to school a little bit longer than me. And speaking of intellectual stimulation, this guy is sharp. And we're going to get, like I said, a little bit of news from the electric scooter world, which is not always positive. Hey, we're saving the environment. Hey, this new rental scooter company is rolling out into a large city metro area, and it's going to save parking, and it's not going to be all rainbows, fairy tales, and unicorns. Does fairy tales fit in there? Maybe not, but let's get this show rolling. Yeah, let's let that music roll a little bit. Check out those drums. I ride a scooter. It is not a non-polluter. Yeah, hit those drums. Woo! And here we pause for reflection on the environment and how much scooters contribute to saving the environment. Well, they're a lot better than the other alternatives, I can tell you that. Oh, we're back. I ride a scooter, not a non-polluter, but it helps, I guess. Hey, aside from saving the environment, ride scooters because they are fun. All right, I love that song. I could continue to listen to it, but let's get on with the show. As I mentioned, later on, we're going to hear from Dr. Graham Conway, who is an automotive engineer, and he's going to let us know that PEVs and electric vehicles in general are not as friendly as commonly thought, And he believes that hybrid vehicles combine smaller batteries with efficient internal combustion engines. And he believes that these hybrid vehicles are better on the environment than electric vehicles. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Some of them I had mentioned earlier. You can't really call them zero emissions. There's no tailpipe emitting emissions. However, the electricity that powers electric vehicles is generated by power plants, 64% of which, in the United States anyway, burn fossil fuels that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming. But there are a lot of things that we haven't really considered that even, like, say, for a car, sunlight reflecting off of the windshield heats up the interior, which gives off emissions. There are so many different things that we just don't think about. There are a lot more, but that's the first one that comes to mind. But first, it's time for Electric Podcast Scooter News. Electric Scooter Podcast News, whichever you prefer. I get it backwards sometimes. I can be dyslexic. Maybe I should call it the Dyslexic Scooter Podcast. Electric Podcast Scooter News. Dagwood here to bring to you. Electric Podcast Scooter News. Dagwood here to bring to you. We have more unfortunate news from New York City. Sadly, a 5-year-old girl and a 36-year-old woman were killed in a high-rise apartment fire sparked by a lithium-ion battery. Now, this was not on a stand-up electric scooter. This was a sit-down type electric scooter, but these batteries are interchangeable with models, so there may be a lesson here.
It's really painful, and I hate that this happened.
Oh, man. How to explain it?
People in East Harlem struggled to find the words, so stunned by the death of 2 people in an overnight fire. It broke out around 2:40 a.m. Wednesday. Residents tell us when they saw the broken windows, they instantly knew who was involved.
We both lived around here about around the same time. You know what I'm saying, since we was little kids.
And had an awful feeling. What happened?
He was charging a bike.
Firefighters confirmed their suspicions with this tweet, saying that they determined that an e-bike battery was to blame. The tragedy now has a man in the hospital in a burn unit in critical condition, and it killed his girlfriend and his 5-year-old little girl. Neighbors say the child was an absolute joy to be around.
Happy, very happy. Very, very happy child. That's the only way you could describe him. You could tell that he was a good parent because she was always smiling. She would see him, run up to him, hug him, kiss him. He was a great dad. We saw the burnt e-bikes involved. Firefighters pulled 3 from the apartment inside the Jackie Robinson houses at 29th and Lex. It's a NYCHA building. An agency rep told us that this is the 10th e-bike fire in a New York City public housing unit since 2019. We've also confirmed that leaders are actively holding hearings, questioning if they should ban e-bikes inside apartments because of fire concerns. These deaths have people in this community shattered, already saying yes.
Tragic lesson, you know what I'm saying? And like I said, my condolences goes out to the family. And I wish this would have never happened.
Well said. We wish these types of incidents never happened, but it should be a reminder to us who ride electric scooters and have lithium batteries. When you go on vacation, make sure you unplug your scooter. I have a habit of when I get back from a long ride, automatically plugging it in, and sometimes I forget to go and unplug it. I've had bad experiences with trickle chargers. It's a different issue. It's motorcycles and cars, but you have something called battery management, and then you have something called trickle charging. Sometimes the charger will continue to provide electricity even though your battery has reached its maximum, and that can actually kill a battery. So all of these scooters have different levels of battery management. They all have some sort of BMS or battery management system. I would just say, to be safe, If you're not at home, unplug your scooter so that you are less likely to have an unfortunate incident like happened with these poor people. Our condolences are extended to the victims and their families from the Electric Scooter Podcast and Scooterheads worldwide. Last episode, I teased the Bugatti scooter. Let's get into it a little bit. You can drop a lot of money on a Bugatti, but this Bugatti you can get for somewhere around $1,000 in the United States of America. You can pick it up at Costco. It's not going to cost you $300,000, but it's also not going to go 300 miles per hour. In fact, the top speed is only 18 miles per hour, and the range, it says 22, so let's give it an estimate of about 18. But here's the good news. It looks pretty cool. It's made of magnesium, and it only weighs 35 pounds. Comes in 3 colors, black, silver, and the color to get is blue. Without a doubt, that is by far the best looking. It's a slick looking scooter. It has turn signals, but they're on the tips of the handlebar, on the very outer part of the handlebar. So if you drop your scooter one time, boom, which I drop mine. I try not to, but it happens. Boom, your turn signals are going to be shattered. But you're going to have that little Bugatti icon. The Bugatti badge is all over that thing. So if you're trying to impress people and you just want something that looks really cool and you want to say you've got a Bugatti, this might be the scooter for you. The 9.0. It's made actually in collaboration with the actual Bugatti car company and an electric accessories company called Bytech, Bytech. We may, in another podcast, talk about the Ducati Pro 1 Evo, or is it the Pro I Evo? I don't know. It's a Pro dash line up and down Evo. But enough about the Ducati. Let's get back to the discussion of Bugatti. You're not going to set the streets on fire. You're not going to have guys on Wolf Warrior or Ryan get whiplash watching you pass by. But it's light. It looks super cool. It does have a thumb throttle. I'm not sure I'm in favor of that. Also, the LCD readout, to me, does not look like it's going to stand up in the sunshine. Maybe it will. Maybe it will where you live. But in Las Vegas, that sun is going to nullify probably everything you're looking at on that LCD screen. Comes with a safety bell. Ding, ding. I'm all for those. In case you're wondering, takes 4 hours to charge. Has electronic ABS at the rear. Maybe that's good, maybe not. As a comparison, the Ducati Evo costs less than half, about $480. But you are going to look cool. It is, to me, in my mind, a cool looking scooter. If you're interested in electric scooters branded by vehicle manufacturers, Jeep has collaborated with Razor to create a Jeep trail rated scooter. It looks really cool in army green, has a fancy paint job. It says trail rated on there. I wouldn't touch this thing with a 10-foot pole, but it looks cool. I mean, you're only going to get maybe 10 miles of range and maybe go 9 or 10 miles per hour, but it's called the Razor, R-A-Z-O-R, Razor Jeep RX 200. I'm sure it's cheap. I'm not going to do a lot of investigation into it. Looks cool, but it doesn't look like it's going to perform. And they're saying it's off-road. It has 8-inch pneumatic tires. If you got a kid, hey, it might be cool, actually. I do not see a price tag. It speeds up to 12 miles per hour. Runtime 40 minutes of continuous use. 200-watt brush motor. And it doesn't say what kind of battery. That tells me it's probably not lithium ion. And they go for a standard retail price of $500. You can get it on Amazon.com or Razor.com. It has a good form factor and all that, but it seems to me that this is going to way underperform what I expect of an off-road electric scooter. When the going gets rough, you don't want to be on this scooter. The Electric Scooter Podcast. It's happening now. And in our final segment of the Electric Scooter Podcast, we're going to listen to an automotive engineer by the name of Dr. Graham Conway. Dr. Conway is an automotive engineer, and this is a TED Talk. I will link the original YouTube video on the podcast page. It comes with a disclaimer. It says, from TED, this talk only reflects the speaker's personal views and interpretation. Several claims in this talk lack scientific support. We flagged this talk because it falls outside the content guidelines TED gives to organizers because they're independently organized by volunteers. So you can take this with a grain of salt. I'm sure a lot of what he's saying is true, and parts of it, as mentioned in the disclaimer, do not reflect or contain support from the science community. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. I hope you will enjoy it and find it enlightening.
Climate change is a hoax, and the electric vehicle is an abomination. Someone once told me that to capture an audience's attention, you need to offend them. And what better way to offend people than to denounce climate change? Because if there's one thing the world may unanimously agree upon, is that we'd all like it to be here in the future. So now that I have your attention, let me revisit those opening comments. I do actually believe in climate change, but I do have a problem with the way we define electric vehicles. So this talk will still offend some people. I can almost see the YouTube comments on this video now. It isn't pretty. But this talk is not about demonizing the electric vehicle unfairly. I absolutely believe they are the future of personal transportation. They do a fantastic job at moving pollution out of densely populated cities. They're fun to drive, and you can get free parking too sometimes. And I know this because I owned an electric vehicle for 3 years, and it was a great car. There will absolutely be a place for the electric vehicle in our future, but not today. Let me start with a question. There are 1 billion passenger cars on the world's roads today. If I gave you a button which would turn them all into electric vehicles, would you push it? The problem of climate change is a global one. It is believed to be caused by increasing CO2 concentrations in our atmosphere. If you put a box around the Earth and measured the gases trapped inside that box, you would indeed find CO2, and that CO2 levels are rising. What is causing CO2 levels to rise? Well, one source is the cars and trucks that we drive. These emit CO2 from the tailpipe. And the way the industry currently measures this CO2 is like putting a special box around the vehicle and measuring what's inside the box. Society's solution to the problem is the electric vehicle. Because if you put a box around the electric vehicle and try and measure CO2, you won't find any. So based on this way of measuring CO2, we've decided to call these zero emissions, or we call these dirty. But let me show you why this is wrong. Consider that instead of changing all vehicles into electric vehicles, we instead change them into horses. Now, a horse breathes in air and it breathes out CO2. So if you put a box around the horse, you would measure CO2. If you rode that horse the same distance as you drove the car, you would find something quite shocking. The horse emits as much CO2 as a Corvette. So you can see, based on this way of measuring CO2, our only possible conclusion is that if we changed all cars into horses, we would be emitting as much CO2 as 1 billion Corvettes. And that doesn't sound very good for the environment, does it? But as you sit there, I'm sure something deep inside of you is saying, that doesn't sound right. And you'd be correct. Of course, if we changed all cars into horses, our climate would be better. And here's why it would be better. You see, even though the horse breathes out CO2 into the atmosphere, that CO2 is then absorbed by plants and converted back into oxygen, which the horse breathes in again. And so you see the CO2 is in a cycle. And because it is in a cycle, it doesn't increase. In contrast, the car is different. Because with the car, we dig oil out of the ground, we burn it, and we produce CO2. And it isn't in a cycle, so it is increasing. So you were right to be skeptical. But based on how we currently measure CO2, you could not possibly have come to this conclusion without doing this type of analysis. Let's go back to the electric vehicle. Remember, the way we quantify CO2 is to measure it from the tailpipe. But the electric car doesn't burn fuel, but it does use electricity. So we have to look at where that comes from. A large proportion of our electricity comes from coal. Now, we dig coal out of the ground in large quantities. We then burn it in power stations, which produces CO2. You can see there is no arrow along the top of this diagram. That CO2 is not in a cycle, and it is increasing. But you couldn't possibly know this by only measuring the vehicle's tailpipe. What we need to do is expand our imaginary box to include everything. And coal isn't the only way we generate electricity. We also burn natural gas and we burn oil. These two produce CO2. Now, you might be sitting there and saying, hang on a minute, I charge my electric vehicle from solar panels on my roof. So that's okay, right? Well, for you, maybe. And many developed nations are moving away from coal and natural gas to renewable energy sources. But CO2 is a global problem. So let's have a look at things on a global scale. How much of the world's electricity is produced by burning fuel, which creates CO2? It's about 2/3. So you can see, when you plug your electric vehicle in, you are probably producing CO2. It just isn't being measured. You see, the automotive industry has cleverly found a way to move the problem, not solve the problem. But is the electric vehicle really worse? Well, to understand if it's worse, we need to look at how much emissions are produced during the life of the vehicle. The average age of a vehicle before it gets scrapped is around 180,000 miles. You can see the conventional vehicle produces about 30 tons of CO2 over its lifetime. How does the electric vehicle look? Pretty good, right? Because some of that electricity comes from renewable sources, and because the electric motor is far more efficient than the internal combustion engine, it produces less CO2. But there is a problem with this graph. This graph says that at 0 miles, 0 CO2 has been produced. And if you think about that for a second, it means that the two cars have magically appeared in the showroom out of thin air. In reality, a huge amount of CO2 is produced just making a vehicle, because you have to dig raw materials out of the ground, transport them to factories where they can be formed into car parts, before finally being assembled into vehicles. Each step requires energy, And so we create CO2. So you can see the conventional vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 6 tons of CO2. And now this is the critical part. Making a battery isn't easy. The materials required are harder to find, and making a battery cell requires a huge amount of energy. So the battery vehicle comes to the showroom having generated about 12 tons of CO2. And you can see you'd have to drive it around 80 or 90,000 miles before you offset that CO2 penalty. But it is better in the end. So the electric vehicle still looks good here as well, right? Well, this is where it gets interesting. You see, the conventional vehicle has a 400-mile range, while the electric vehicle in this example has a 125-mile range. Now, 125 miles might be enough for some of you, but most of us want more. We'd like to be able to drive great distances across the states. Or if you're here in Texas, you might just want to get to the next city. So really, we need to be comparing a 400-mile range electric vehicle. And as you may have guessed, a longer range requires a larger battery, which means a larger CO2 penalty. And now you start to see the problem. Over its expected lifetime, it has emitted more CO2 than the conventional vehicle. It has contributed more to climate change than the conventional vehicle, and that is the crux of the problem. It has produced more CO2, but we've measured none. And so society is happy to continue to call these zero emissions. But that is dangerous and unproductive. But there is something we can do today, using technology we have today, which will make a difference today. And that is to look at hybrids. Hybrids are far more efficient than conventional vehicles because at low speeds, where the engine is inefficient, the electric motor compensates and says, "Don't worry, engine, I've got this. You stay turned off until we need you." And critically, a hybrid has a small battery. So the initial CO2 penalty is similar to the conventional vehicle, while the end-of-life emissions are far lower. In fact, to offset the CO2 from the electric vehicle, you would need to drive it around 450,000 miles before you offset that CO2. But again, I don't want to demonize the electric vehicle. I just don't think we should adopt them today based on the way we generate our electricity and the way we make our batteries. But how can we help the electric vehicle meet its potential? Well, we need to invest in making our electricity generation from renewable sources around the world, so that when we plug our electric cars in, we know there is no CO2 being generated. We can do this by building solar and wind farms. If we did that, then you can see the difference we can make to the emissions created during the life of the vehicle. And we can go further too. We can invest in new battery technologies, battery production techniques to help offset that initial CO2 penalty. And so you can see the potential of the electric vehicle. You can see what it could look like in the future. It's just as a society, we are trillions of dollars and decades away from achieving this. But we will get there one day. But what we don't want to do today is mislead people into buying electric vehicles by falsely calling them zero emissions. What we need to do instead is to continue to invest in the internal combustion engine. It hasn't met its maximum potential yet. And we can look into renewable fuels. This is where we combine water with the waste CO2 to create fuels for our vehicles. Now, there's a good reason we don't do this today. It requires a huge amount of energy to do this. But if all that energy comes from renewable sources, then it isn't a problem for the climate. So you see, we've created a new CO2 cycle. And you can see how fantastic that looks for the hybrid vehicle over the lifetime emissions. Even without renewable fuels, we should still consider buying hybrids today if we want to impact climate change now. In the future, there will be conventional vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and electric vehicles where they make sense. The future is not just electric, the future is eclectic. So let me leave you with this. If I gave you that button, based on what you now know, would you push it? Thank you.
You say alrighty and I say alrighty, and that was Dr. Graham Conway. What do you think about that? You agree with what he's saying? Do you disagree? Is the science faulty? Let me know at dagwoodstreets@gmail.com or contact me for any reason you want to at all. But I will leave you with my own quote from Benjamin Franklin. Energy and persistence conquer all things. Until next time, scooterheads, keep the shiny side up, the dirty side down. And if it's within your budget and you're going over 20 miles an hour, wear a full-faced helmet. Hello.